Welcome to week 1 of the New Testament Deeper Learning Theology course. Today we will be looking at something of the history of the New Testament, just something of what life was like for the people of the New Testament, and a brief look at the different writings of the New Testament. Now, it's always helpful to understand something of the background before we read the letters, before we read the Gospels. The same as in the Old Testament, when we understand something of the history and the background and the situation, those stories come alive. And so today we'll be exploring just briefly the history, the background, what life was like for people in the New Testament. You know, a lot of times I think to myself, I would have loved to have lived in the time of Jesus. But the more I hear of what life was like for people in those times, the more I realize that we have it relatively easy in life today. We have our challenges, but they had their own challenges in the time of Jesus. And one of the things that's helpful is to remember the situation, the world situation at that time. In that time, in the time of Jesus, the Romans had been in control. They came into control after the Greeks. We stopped the history of the Old Testament at the Greeks. The Romans started rising to power after the Greeks. And as they rose to power, they took over this Palestinian area. Remember the promised land, this fertile crescent, this place that everyone wanted. The Romans eventually took control of that as well. And when the Romans took control of that, they actually had control of that whole region right through the whole writing of the New Testament. So the Old Testament, we see our different world powers come into place. The New Testament was written throughout the whole time being under Roman rule. Now, Roman rule had its own challenges. The first thing is that we need to understand the way that the Romans functioned. Is they had what was called an emperor. Now, the emperor was their Caesar. It started with Caesar Augustus. In the notes, it actually goes through all the different Caesars that they had in the time of the New Testament, and how some of these Caesars, like the first one in the time when Jesus was born, was actually a very good Caesar. He, in actual fact, brought peace to Rome and the whole of the Roman Empire, which included Israel and Judea. And he was known as the Peace of Rome, or the Prince of Peace. So it's quite significant that Jesus is born in his time. After him, there came other different emperors, and some of them treated the Jesus movement really well, others treated them horrifically. Nero, for example, in his time, which was after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, one of the things he did for the Jesus movement is that there was a massive fire in Rome, and because people were anti the Jesus movement already, he actually blamed the fire on these Christians. He said that the Christians had started the fire, and there was mass persecution of all Christians. And so we see these emperors, the different emperors had different ways of ruling, and these different ways of ruling impacted the Jesus movement. Some of them were gracious and kind to the Jesus movement, others were really, really harsh on the Jesus movement. And so if you read the notes, you'll see all the different emperors and the way that they treated people in the time of the New Testament. The other thing that's important to remember, and this impacts the New Testament more than perhaps even who the emperor was, is the way that the Roman government worked. So the Roman Empire has taken over. They have control of the whole of the known world, if I could put it that way. They have rule over every little nation, including the Judeans, where Jesus was. And the way that the Romans ruled is that they ruled with an iron fist. They ruled with cruelty. So what they would do is if you disobeyed, they would make an example of you. If you rebelled, they would make an example of you. They would crucify, or they would flog, they would find really gruesome, violent ways of controlling the people. What they did is that the emperor would appoint different people, different governors of different areas and different regions. And if a region was very, very rebellious, they would get a Roman governor that would be in control of that region. And the Roman governor was generally high up in the military, and he would exert whatever power and violence possible to keep that region under control. If a region wasn't as rebellious, then sometimes the emperor would allow a local person to have control. But generally, that local person would have had favor with the emperor because he would have paid an enormous amount to the Roman emperor in order to obtain this rule. And so we see in the New Testament, in the time of Jesus, particularly in the Gospels, and right through to Acts, we see that there were different rulers of the regions of Israel. And sometimes we get confused as to who was who because it's so confusing. You see, at the beginning, what had happened was just before Jesus was born, Herod the Great came into power. Now, Herod the Great, he was half Israelite. He was half Jewish. He came from, I suppose you could say, royalty from the other side of his bloodline. But what happened was when the Maccabees, just before Jesus, when they rebelled, Herod the Great, his family was clever, and they went to Rome and they won favor of the emperor. Obviously, they bribed him, they paid him, they rewarded him handsomely. And so the emperor actually gave control and helped Herod the Great build up an army and take over the whole of the Israelite region, the whole of the Jewish region during the time or just before the time of Jesus. Herod the Great was in control for quite a long time. And when Jesus was born, he was in control at that point. And so he's the Herod that they speak about having killed all of those babies when Jesus was born. Now, Herod the Great, they called him King Herod because the way that the emperor worked is if you were the most favored local ruler, he would appoint you as king. And then it went down in status to like tetrarch and all those things. So when it talks about King Herod, he was not from the Davidic line of kingship, but rather he was appointed as king by the Roman emperor over that region. Now, King Herod the Great was good at some things. He loved building, and he was very, very good at building. He built the second, or actually the third temple, Herod's temple, and he did a tremendous job. He made it better than it had ever been. Herod built a port all the way at Caesarea, where Paul was later actually held in prison. And the ruins are still there today. Herod built amphitheaters and theaters, and he built palaces, and he built fortresses. He was a tremendous builder, and he loved Greek philosophy and Greek culture. But there's a price to pay when the person in charge loves building, and the price was taxes. You see, the Roman emperor, they had their own taxes. So if your country or your region belonged to Roman rule, you would have to pay tribute to the Romans in order to have peace in your place. And so they were heavily taxed. The people were heavily taxed by the Romans. To make matters worse, is the way the tax collectors worked in those days, is they bid for the job. And so a tax collector would go out and he would pay a bid. He would say to the governor or to whoever's in control, he would say, I can get this amount of money out of the people. And another guy would come and say, oh, but I can get a little bit more out of the people. And that's what they would do. And they would give it to the highest bidder. There was also road taxes. And then the tax collectors would put their own profit on top of the tax that they were putting out there. And so there was the Roman tax. Then Herod the Great comes along. He wants to build. He has all these tremendous plans to build massive fortresses and palaces and temples and all these things. And where do you think he gets the money? Is he taxes the people. And so the people are taxed by Herod. They're taxed by the Romans. They're taxed by the tax collectors. They pay a road tax in order to try and trade. And you just get this impression that throughout Roman rule, the people were heavily, heavily taxed. And so, and we'll touch on this a little bit later, there was tremendous poverty in the time of Jesus. But before we touch on what life was like for the people of Jesus, I'd like to go back to Herod the Great. Now, Herod the Great was, he was not only a tremendous builder, he was also very, very paranoid. Herod the Great was so paranoid that he had most or many of his family members killed. His brother-in-law was killed at a party. Apparently, he drowned in a pool party. He killed his wife's grandfather. He eventually killed 3 of his sons. He even killed his one wife. The story of his wife is quite horrific. What had happened was he had to go to Rome and he wasn't sure if he was going to come back alive or not. And so he said to his guards, because he loved this wife apparently, and he said to his guards that if I don't come back, please have her killed, because I don't want her to be with any other man. He then did come back, and she found out about this plot and was so angry with him that she wanted nothing to do with him. And when she wanted nothing to do with him, he had her tried and convicted and killed for apparently having an affair. And so Herod was also very paranoid. He was vicious, he was paranoid, he was a builder. Part of his paranoia was that he was convinced people wanted his kingdom all the time. And so anyone in his family even that looked like they were going to take over his kingdom, he would have them killed. And so he even had 3 of his own sons killed because he thought they were trying to take over his kingdom. There was a saying that said, it was better to be Herod's pig than his son. It was better for you if you were Herod's pig than if you were his son. And the reason they had that saying is because he tried to obey Jewish laws and not eat pork, and yet he would kill his own sons. And so there was this ironic saying of how he had these double standards, and it was safer to be a pig in his house than to be a child. Herod eventually died completely isolated, alone, rejected. People did not like Herod. Even his family, obviously, were afraid of him and didn't like him. And what he then did is when he died, he left his kingdom to 3 of his sons. And so Israel was then, or Judea was then divided into different regions. And those different regions are explained nicely in the notes, but they were divided into different regions. And so suddenly we had Herod Antipas and we had Herod Philippi. And then the one son didn't do so well. And so the Roman emperor realized that that particular region was not doing very well and they were often in conflict. And so he gave that to governors of Rome, so to military control. And many years later, eventually that governor was Pontius Pilate. And so that's why Pilate, when Jesus comes to him and is arrested, Pilate turns around and says, but wait a minute, he wasn't working in my region, he was working in that guy's region, and he sends him to Herod. It's a different Herod to the one who had John the Baptist beheaded, and it was a different Herod to the one who had all the babies killed when Jesus was born. You see, and that when we understand how there were different regions and different governors or people in control, we understand something of the New Testament stories that we read, particularly in the Gospels. And so that's just a brief look at the world history. The whole New Testament was under Roman rule. As sometimes the Israelites listened to the Romans after Jesus, particularly just before 70 AD, after Jesus, 70 years after Jesus, the Israelites started rebelling more and more and more. One of the reasons was there was a Caesar and he was really, really not great. He believed he was God and wanted everyone to treat him as a god. And he tried to put a statue of himself in the Jewish temple. And you can imagine that that didn't go down well. This was the same emperor who tried to say that his horse was actually a nobleman and had a stall made of marble and covered the horse in purple and made everyone address this horse as one of the nobles in the kingdom. He was a little bit cooked. Eventually, his actual bodyguards had him assassinated, and that's what stopped all of that. But all of this sparked a massive rebellion. And so we see the history in the New Testament was that they were always under Roman rule. And then right towards the end, in about 70 AD, they rebelled against Rome, and the Romans annihilated the temple. They put everyone under siege, and eventually they actually had all of the Jewish people banned from Jerusalem. They kicked them out. And the Jews then became a diaspora Jews, a spread out Jewish people. They no longer had a land right up until after the Second World War. And so that's the New Testament. They were always under control of somebody foreign. They were always under control of the Romans, and there were just different degrees of rebellion that happened under the Roman rule. You can imagine, because they were always under the Roman rule, life was not always easy. There was quite a lot of poverty because of the high tax, because of the land. So what would happen is that the poor people, in order to pay their taxes, they relied on agriculture. So when their farming didn't go very well, they didn't have money to pay the taxes, and so they would have to loan money. So the rich would loan the poor money, but they would charge interest, and eventually the poor couldn't pay their loans, and so the rich would say, okay, well, I'll own your land and you then work for me. And so the poor became poorer and poorer and poorer and poorer until the majority of the people were peasants in the time of Jesus. Farmers were peasants. Artisans, people who worked with their hands, like carpenters, were actually below that, and fishermen were below farmers as well. And so Jesus, when we see Jesus enters into the world, he really comes into a time where the poor are the poorest of the poor, and he enters into a profession that is at the bottom of the range. And so Jesus enters as one of the poorest of the poor in the time of the New Testament. The gap between the rich and the poor was tremendous. There was no middle class. You were either a peasant or you were the elite. You were either a peasant and barely able to survive, or you were so rich that you never had to work a day in your life. And the percentage of those who were so rich was less than 5% of the population. And so you get this impression that there was just absolute poverty in the time of Jesus. To describe some of that poverty, you can imagine that what was happening is that people would move to the city centers trying to get work. The city centers, the Roman way of life in the cities was that they didn't have proper sanitation, they didn't have proper water, and so they say that you could smell the city from a couple of miles away. You could smell when you were approaching a city because of the poor hygiene in the city centers. And because of that, there were health issues, and often they would have plagues that would come in and wipe out a big percentage of the population because of poor hygiene. And so I get this impression of Jesus walking around from town to town, Jesus walking around among the poor, and we must realize that he was walking around with people who were really, really suffering. They believed that the good things of life, love, relaxation, possessions, power, prestige, majority of the people believed that those things were only meant for the richest of the rich. And you could only become elite through birth. And so Jesus ministers to people who believed that their fate, that their life was always just about mere survival. Because of the extreme poverty, the lifespan of people was also very, very low. And so the average lifespan was only 30 years old. It is said that the majority of people would die as infants, and by the age of 16 you would be lucky if your parents, either one of your parents, was still alive by the time you hit puberty. That's how quickly, or that's how many people were passing away because of extreme conditions of life, because of the poverty that the people were living under. And so life was hard. Life was hard, and it was believed that only the elite were blessed. It was believed that if you were rich, then God's grace had been shining on you. It was believed that if you were poor, that was your fate, that is who you are, and you deserved it. You then had the poorest of the poor. There were people who were isolated. They weren't allowed near the elite. They were the unclean, the ones that were kept out of the city gates even. They were the ones that when the city gates closed at night, they were kicked out and they had to sleep outside. They were the prostitutes, and they were the ones that had no form of income. They were the ones who had leprosy, the blind, the lame, the sick, the possessed. They had nothing to offer to society, and so they were kept outside of it. And Jesus enters into these harsh conditions. And he doesn't minister to those with power and the elite. He doesn't go to those who are blessed and live among them. Jesus finds those who have been completely outcast, the lost, the lonely, the suffering, the isolated. And that's where he ministers. Jesus' work was profound because no other teacher of the law, no other religious group, religious leader showed ministry to the poor, to the outcast, to the broken the way that Jesus did in that time. They just accepted it as the way of life. The other part of the way that life worked in those days is that they used to live in groups. They used to work and function in groups. You know, in South Africa today, and in the Western world particularly, not so much in Africa. Africa gets this a little bit better. The Africans believe in Ubuntu and how I am a person because we are people. You know, but the Western world is a lot more individualistic. And so we see it how most of us don't know our neighbors. If we do know our neighbors, we don't ever have anything to do with them, or we have very little to do with them. We see it in how, as long as I'm safe, that's okay. It doesn't really matter what happens with the person next door to me or around me or in my area. So we build bigger walls and electric fences just so that I'm safe. In the time of Jesus, there was nothing like individualistic lifestyle. Everything was about the group you belonged to. So you would belong to a group, whether that was a group because you were fishermen, whether it was you belonged to the tax collector group, whether it was you belonged to the farming group. There were groups, and you belonged to your group, and everything you did was with and for the sake of that group. And you didn't mingle. So men would stay with men, women would mingle with women, Jews would mingle with Jews, Gentiles with Gentiles, Greeks with Greeks, Romans with Romans, Pharisees with Pharisees. There was no intermingling. You did not mingle with other groups. You only did business with them when you had to, but you stayed within your group. The other thing about the groups was that if you did something right, your group was honored. If you did something shameful, your group was shamed. And so it was all about this group lifestyle and all these different groups that were different from each other. And so there were these massive dividing lines between the different groups. And even in own households, generally the men and the women of households would not even mingle. they would live and stay and mingle separately. And so now you can imagine that that's the norm. That's all that everyone knows. And this Jesus movement starts. And first, Jesus starts it by getting fishermen and tax collectors together. He starts it by mingling with women and the poor and those with leprosy. And Jesus starts this different way where he starts intermingling these groups. And then the Jesus movement happens after Jesus ascends. And suddenly groups of people find commonality in the belief of Jesus as the Messiah. And it does an amazing thing, is it mingles these groups. Suddenly, men and women are meeting together to discuss the way of Jesus. Suddenly, we have Jews and Gentiles meeting together. There are some of the rich meeting with the poor. Slaves meeting with the free, fishermen, tax collectors, those with no positions, those in high position, priests. Everyone starts mingling together and gathering in groups in people's houses to discuss this way of Jesus. And I find it exciting. But the rest of the people didn't, because for them it was unnatural. It was unheard of. You didn't mingle with other groups. And here's this Jesus movement doing something really strange where different people are gathering together and they're having a meal where they talk about eating the body and drinking the blood of Jesus. And the people around them were deeply challenged by this Jesus movement. Bear that in mind when we read Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus, if you belong to Christ. Thanks be to God for his word. You see, this Jesus movement that we will look at in the New Testament, it was profound, it was revolutionary, it was insane, and it was life-changing.